This is what you want to get down to when you're talking about sweeping, when you're talking about tapping, you're talking about even. I love that you did throw hammer-ons and pull-offs in there because that's in the same vein of sort of dressing up what it is that you're playing. And I think a lot of people when they get to the level of tapping and sweeping, they're not really thinking of hammer-ons and pull-offs as the same thing. What you want to do when you're doing these improvisational solos is you want to make sure the solo is interesting already, so that when you add like the tapping or the hammer-ons and pull-offs or the slides or whatever it is that you're dressing it up, that just makes it a little bit cooler. You know what I mean? That's not something that you want to rely on. Also, there's also two ways to think about those kind of like, they're kind of like spices rather than the actual food itself. But something to think about too is like when we're talking about stuff like motifs, so you're not just like, drifting along in the scale, like not really playing anything. When we're talking about motifs, you can potentially use some of those as a motif. I mean, that's what tapping kind of essentially is. If you have like, your solo and then you have a part where it's just like, that tapping becomes a motif, If it's not going to be a motif, which I don't recommend doing a lot of, I never really recommend using any one of these sort of spices kind of a thing as an actual motif. But if you are, don't do that too much either. But you want to make sure that what you're playing, you're not sitting in one area too much. You know what I mean? You're not the guy that's tapping too much. You're not the guy that's sweeping too much. You're not the guy that's only doing hammer-on pull-offs and trills. I distinctly remember at a guitar workshop, we were doing like a lot of like just blues stuff, and the guy I made buddies with one of the guys that was there, and he just kept doing. Every note that he played was like this sort of like Stevie Ray Vaughan rake into the note, and he didn't even notice that he was doing it, which was kind of wild. But that idea of like the overusage of those little things is just that sort of like insecurity that musically what you're playing is not up to par. You know what I mean? That's sort of how it happens. If you're constantly going back to one thing, especially the tapping and the sweeping, because that's just trying to implement technique and speed in somewhere in hopes that it pulls away from a sort of lack, like someone noticing the lack of musicality. There is a really interesting concept that people talk about where it's playing faster is easier than playing slower, right? Not necessarily technically, not in a technique way, but if I do have this, like, you don't know what was that? Yeah, playing. Yeah, okay, so you do, you do agree, because if I play this, like that little run that I just did had a bunch of wrong notes or chromatic notes in it, but you can't really tell because I'm not sitting on those notes, and if you were to play that, anything will go under it, you could just do, but if you were to actually play, you sort of have to have a better musical understanding, because what you're playing is fitting over top of the music rather than just like, some sort of like metal, background and you're just like shredding on top of it and it doesn't, you can kind of get away with it. So yeah, that is something to think about. Not technically, not in a technique way is playing slow or harder. You know what I mean? But yeah, making it sound interesting definitely is.